Hello, class. Welcome to our continuation of oral narratives, where we're going to continue looking at the types of oral narratives. We've so far looked at myths and legends, folktales and fairy tales, epics, creation stories, historical narratives, and let's continue to dive deep and understand more of the other types of oral narratives. So right now we're going to dive deep and focus on another type of oral narrative, the law and traditional narratives. The law and traditional narratives. Now, what are these law and traditional narratives? Law and traditional law and oral traditional narratives are stories, legends, rituals, customs, and knowledge that are passed down orally from one generation to another within a culture or a community. So these are narratives that are stories, and these stories include legend stories, rituals, customs, knowledge that are passed down orally from one generation to another. So there are stories, there are legends, there are rituals, there are customs, and knowledge that are passed down orally from one generation to another within a culture or a community. These narratives are often deeply rooted in the history, values, beliefs, and practices of a specific group of people. They are transmitted through spoken word, songs, and chants, or storytelling and other oral means. So basically, law and traditional narratives, we've had several generations, and one thing you'll notice is that some practices that were done in the past are still done in the present day, and they're still done today. So why is the reason of this? What is the reason of this existence of such practices? This will tail back to law and traditional narratives. So these are stories or legends or rituals or customs or knowledge that are passed down orally from one generation to another within a community or a specific culture or one specific culture. So these are law and traditional narratives. So they're transmitted through spoken words. They can be songs, chants, and storytelling. You find that different communities in a certain nation or a certain country, they have a common or a well-known chant among them, or a song that is among them, or a certain story that is common among them. And you'll find that these stories have a main idea, or they speak about a specific event, or they have a main function, or the main idea behind the story. So the main idea mostly is to pass a ritual or a custom or a knowledge from one generation to another, trying to understand it and trying to pass the way of life of that community to another generation. Now we look at the features. We look at the features now of law and oral tradition narratives. What are these features? How can you tell that this is a traditional narrative or a law narrative? Oral transmission. This is the first feature. So these narratives are primarily passed down orally from one generation to the next. They may be recited, chanted, sung, or performed in rituals or ceremony. For example, this is very crucial in our day-to-day life. For example, let me give an example of maybe a wedding session. And in this context, we're talking about a traditional wedding. So you'll find that there are specific songs that have been sung and have always been there during every traditional wedding. And giving another example of a funeral service or a traditional funeral service, you'll find that there are specific chants or specific songs that are sung during these occasions, and they have always been in existence. They have always been sung. They have always been told to the public. So this is what we call oral transmission. They can be recited, they can be sung, or they can be performed in rituals or ceremonies. And I've given examples of, we have wedding ceremonies, funeral ceremonies. We also have traditional ceremonies. They have specific rituals that they do, and these rituals have been done in the past and are still being done. So this is one feature of law and oral tradition. Next, we'll focus on variability. Over time, oral tradition can evolve with different storytellers adding their own interpretation, embellishments, or variations to narratives. What do I mean by variability? So we find the context or the main theme of the narrative is the same. Maybe it's a funeral song. It's just the same from the past, but you'll find that there's some words that have been changed or there's an addition of some words. So this specifically means that it's changing over time. So with time, people are adding their own ways or removing some other parts from these law or oral tradition narratives. So they change with time or they vary with time. So this is one feature you'll notice with most law and oral tradition narratives. So they have variability. People will add their own interpretation. For example, someone may choose to interpret a text the way they want, and this is not a crime. Anyone is entitled to their own thinking or their own perspective, the way they understand their interpretation. So they will vary with time or they will vary with different storytellers because they will add or remove some interpretations according to themselves. Another feature is cultural specificity. Cultural specificity. What do I mean by cultural specificity? Law and oral traditional narratives are closely tied to specific cultures, communities, or indigenous groups, reflecting their unique customs, language, and worldviews. So these narratives are tied to specific cultures. Not every culture or not every group of people will believe in the same narrative or have the same tradition. So they are specifically tied to a specific culture or a specific community or a specific indigenous group of people because they will talk about their custom, their language, and their worldview. So different communities again have a different perspective in which they view the world or different practices, different things that they engage in every day. So this is one feature when it comes to oral narratives. Now, after looking at the features of oral narratives, I will move on to the importance of law and oral narratives. Why do we need to know law and oral narratives? What are their importance? Why do we need to study them? Now, the first importance is cultural preservation. Cultural preservation. So, law and oral narratives, they are crucial for preserving a culture's history, customs, identity, particularly in societies where written records are scarce or absent. Now, you want to preserve your culture. So preserving your culture means passing the culture from one generation to another, talking to or telling a story to the young generation from the past. So the main idea of passing this information is to preserve culture, and law and oral narratives is the best way or the best narratives that preserve culture and preserve practices of a community. So this is one importance as to why we should understand the law and the law and the oral narrative or oral traditional narratives. Next is interpersonal and community bonds. Interpersonal and community bonds. The fact of sharing and passing down these narratives fosters a sense of community and integrational bonds. It strengthens the connection between individuals and their cultural heritage. So this is self-explanatory because the more you pass down a specific history from one generation to another, the only idea or the main idea in the entire passing down of narrative is to foster a sense of community or a bond. You're trying to bring an intergenerational bond between people of the same community. So one main idea is interpersonal and community bonds. They majorly help you to understand or identify to a certain community or a certain way of life in which the community practices or does their stuff. So this is an importance of law narratives. Another importance is practical and cultural knowledge. Practical and cultural knowledge. Law often includes practical knowledge such as herbal remedies, hunting techniques, agricultural practices, and navigation skills. which are essential in the daily life in certain communities. Now, this is a very common practice. Now, you find that traditional people used to have a certain way as to how they did certain practices, like the cultural practices like the fishing, hunting, herbal medicines, like trying to create the herbal medicines. And you find that to date, there are people who use the traditional way to treat people or treat diseases or treat certain sicknesses. This is because their culture or this culture has been passed down to them by their great grandparents or their great relatives or people from the past. So this importance is that it enables you to have knowledge of the past, knowledge of a hunting technique, knowledge of agricultural practices, or trying to find some medicinal remedy for a person. So you use the cultural way. So this is one important because it preserves these ideas of herbal remedies, hunting techniques, and agricultural practices. These skills are essentials for today's life in certain communities because some certain communities still practice fishing, maybe hunting, or they want to carry out the agriculture in a traditional way. So this is one importance. After looking at the importance, we'll dive deep into the how we can recognize these narratives. How can you know this is a low and oral narrative? So they're orally transmitted. So they're passed down from one generation to another. They are not written, so they're passed orally, and they can be through stories. And these narratives are often shared within a community through storytelling sessions, through ceremonies or gatherings. So these are the events in which the oral narratives are told. So we talked about ceremony like wedding ceremony, funeral ceremonies, and other ceremonies. So this is when these narratives are told or spoken to the people. So they're shared within a community through storytelling sessions and so ceremonies or gatherings. So when people are together, maybe they want to listen to a certain story. This is where they are transmitted orally, so by word of mouth. Another way to recognize them is cultural and community context. These narratives are deeply embedded in a cultural and communal context of a specific group of people. They often reflect the values, beliefs, and practices of the community. Now, this like the way from its word, oral traditional narratives or low or oral traditional narratives, they are embedded or they are so rooted into the cultural and communal context. So most of the things or practices will majorly be talking about these narratives in a cultural way. Another how to recognize them is variations. So be aware of oral traditional narratives. They can vary over time from one storyteller to another, while the core elements remain consistent or variation may exist. So what do I mean by variations? As much as the main or the core element of the history is the same, maybe it's a traditional wedding, so the main idea or the core elements of the chant will remain the same, but you'll find some variation. Maybe the storyteller may choose to add some words or remove some words. So this is one way to recognize they are different, they vary, but the same context, they have the same main element, or this core element is the same. So the difference will come in way they choose to interpret it or talk about it. So I will look at one example of this narrative. Example of a low traditional narrative is indigenous creation stories. So many indigenous cultures have oral tradition narratives that explain the creation of the world, the origin of their people, and their relationship with the land. Their stories often play a central role in the indigenous cosmology and spirituality. So here we're not talking about creation stories, no. Here it's just a specific group, just a specific type of indigenous people or a specific community. They have a specific culture and a specific way in which they build in their tradition and understand their tradition. So through this, they will get to have their own meaning of life. They will look at the origin of their people, their own people, or try to understand where their origin was. So they will date back to the past and understand where they came from according to their own perspective. So the stories are central in the indigenous people. They center on themselves, they focus on themselves instead of giving a wide perspective of the story. So they will majorly talk about themselves, where they came from, how they came to existence in a specific area, or how they got themselves in a specific geographical area. So this is An example of this